The antique silver ring looked ordinary enough, tarnished, worn smooth by decades of wear, with an eagle clutching arrows that most people barely noticed. But when 23-year-old Sarah Mitchell slipped it onto her finger at the military recruitment center in downtown Phoenix, she had no idea it would change everything. Within hours, a four-star general would drop to one knee before her, and the entire base would fall silent in recognition of what she carried. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Mitchell had been staring at the recruitment office's glass doors for 20 minutes, her grandmother's ring catching the harsh Arizona sun as her fingers drummed against her jeans. The weight of expectation pressed down on her shoulders like the desert heat. 3 generations of military service, and here she was, the granddaughter who'd chosen art school over West Point, finally ready to follow the family tradition at 23. The ring had belonged to her grandmother, Colonel Elizabeth Harrison, a woman whose steel-gray eyes and ramrod posture had commanded respect in every room she entered. Sarah barely remembered her, just flashes of perfectly pressed uniforms, the scent of Old Spice aftershave, and hands that were surprisingly gentle when they braided Sarah's hair. Elizabeth had died when Sarah was 7, but not before pressing this ring into her small palm with words that made no sense at the time. "This belongs to warriors, little one. Someday you'll understand." Inside the recruitment center, Sergeant Rodriguez looked up from his paperwork with practiced efficiency. At 42, he'd seen every type of recruit walk through those doors. Cocky high school athletes, desperate college dropouts, starry-eyed patriots, and cynical job seekers. Sarah didn't fit any of his usual categories. She carried herself with quiet confidence, her dark blonde hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing jeans and a vintage band t-shirt that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else. "I want to enlist," she said, her voice steady despite the nervous energy radiating from her frame. Rodriguez nodded, sliding a clipboard across the desk. "Army, I assume? Your paperwork mentioned family military history." 3 generations of Army officers, Sarah confirmed, accepting the pen he offered, though I'm probably not what they had in mind. As she filled out the forms, Rodriguez noticed the ring. It was an unusual piece, clearly military in design, but unlike anything in current service. The eagle's head was turned to the right instead of left, and the arrows it clutched seemed to be arranged in a pattern he couldn't quite place. The silver had an odd patina that spoke of age and handling, not the bright polish of modern military jewelry. "Family heirloom?" he asked, gesturing toward her hand. Sarah glanced down, twisting the ring unconsciously. "My grandmother's. She was a colonel, serving from 1942 to 1967. I wear it for luck, I guess." Rodriguez smiled politely and returned to the paperwork. He'd heard dozens of family stories, each recruit carrying some piece of their military heritage like a talisman. This seemed no different, a young woman trying to connect with a past she'd never really known. The next few hours blurred together in a series of tests, interviews, and medical examinations. Sarah found herself shuttled between different offices, each staffed by personnel who treated her with professional courtesy tinged with mild skepticism. Her test scores were excellent, nearly perfect on the ASVAB, but her late entry into military life raised eyebrows. Most officers started their careers at 18 or 22, not after spending 5 years earning an art degree and working in galleries. It was Major Patricia Vance who first noticed something different about the ring. Vance had been conducting routine interviews all afternoon, her patience worn thin by a parade of unremarkable candidates. At 55, she was one of the few women who'd climbed the ranks in an era when female officers faced obstacles Sarah's generation couldn't imagine. She had sharp eyes and sharper instincts, honed by 3 decades of military service and 2 combat deployments. When Sarah entered her office, Vance was immediately struck by the young woman's bearing. Despite her casual clothes and unconventional path to military service, Sarah moved with the unconscious discipline of someone raised in military households. Her posture was perfect without being rigid, her responses crisp without being rehearsed. But it was the ring that made Vance pause mid-sentence during their discussion of career goals. The afternoon sun streaming through the office window caught the silver just right, illuminating details that had been hidden in shadow. The eagle's feathers showed intricate engraving work that was definitely not standard military issue. More intriguingly, there were tiny letters etched around the band, so small they were barely visible unless the light hit them perfectly. "That's an interesting piece of jewelry," Vance said carefully. "May I ask where it came from?" Sarah repeated the story about her grandmother, adding details she hadn't shared with Rodriguez. "Colonel Elizabeth Harrison. She served in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. I don't know much about her service record. My father didn't like talking about the military when I was growing up. But she left me this ring and told me it belonged to warriors." Vance felt something cold settle in her stomach. She'd been in the Army long enough to recognize the names that mattered, the legends whispered in officers' clubs and military academies. Elizabeth Harrison wasn't just any colonel. She was Elizabeth Harrison, the first woman to lead men in combat during World War II, the officer who'd held a strategic bridge in Korea for 3 days against impossible odds, the intelligence specialist who'd broken enemy codes in Vietnam. But more than that, Elizabeth Harrison had been part of something so classified, so compartmentalized, that even most generals didn't know the full story. Vance had only heard fragments during her years working in military intelligence, pieces of a puzzle that painted the picture of an elite unit that officially never existed. "Excuse me for just a moment," Vance said, her voice carefully neutral. "I need to make a quick phone call." Sarah nodded, settling back in her chair as Vance stepped into the hallway. Through the office's thin walls, she could hear the major's voice, urgent and low, though she couldn't make out the words. The conversation lasted nearly 10 minutes, with long pauses that suggested whoever was on the other end was doing most of the talking. When Vance returned, her demeanor had shifted completely. The professional courtesy remained, but underneath it was something that looked almost like reverence. "Sarah," she said, sitting down with deliberate care, "I'm going to ask you something that might sound strange. That ring, has anyone else in your family ever worn it? Any other family members in the military?" "Just my grandmother, as far as I know," Sarah replied, confusion creeping into her voice. "My father left the Army after one tour in the 80s, said military life wasn't for him. My grandfather died before I was born. He was a civilian, I think." Vance nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving the ring. "Sarah, I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you is not something we typically share with new recruits. Your grandmother's service record is still partially classified, even now, almost 60 years later. What I can tell you is that she was involved in operations that shaped American military doctrine in ways that are still felt today." Sarah's mouth went dry. "I don't understand. She was just a colonel. My father always said she was a desk officer, that she pushed papers and managed supplies." "Your father was protecting you," Vance said gently, "and probably protecting himself. The truth is, Elizabeth Harrison was one of the most decorated officers in Army history, and most of her decorations are still classified. That ring you're wearing? It's not just a family heirloom. It's a symbol of recognition that only a handful of people in the world would understand." The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. Sarah looked down at the ring, seeing it with new eyes. The eagle suddenly seemed more fierce, the arrows more purposeful. The weight of it on her finger felt different, heavier, more significant. "What kind of operations?" she asked, finally. Vance hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "The kind that kept America safe while the public slept peacefully in their beds. The kind that required people to disappear into enemy territory for months at a time, gathering intelligence that prevented wars or ended them quickly. Your grandmother was what we call a force multiplier, one person who could accomplish what entire battalions couldn't." Sarah's mind raced, trying to reconcile this image with her fragmented memories of a kind woman who made hot chocolate and told bedtime stories. But she seemed so normal. When I was little, she was just grandmother. That's what made her so effective, Vance replied. The best operators are the ones who can blend into any situation, become whoever they need to be. Your grandmother could be a society hostess at a diplomatic reception one night and a demolitions expert behind enemy lines the next. She saved more lives than we'll ever be able to count. A knock on the door interrupted them. Rodriguez appeared, looking slightly bewildered. "Ma'am, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just received a very unusual phone call. Apparently, we need to arrange immediate transport for Miss Mitchell to Fort Braxton. General Morrison wants to meet with her personally." Vance and Sarah exchanged glances. Fort Braxton was home to some of the Army's most elite units, the kind of place where careers were made or ended based on missions that never appeared in official records. "Did the general say why?" Vance asked, though her eyes suggested she already knew. Rodriguez shook his head. Just that it was a matter of national security, and that Miss Mitchell should bring any personal items that belonged to her grandmother. He was very specific about that. Sarah's hand went instinctively to the ring, twisting it around her finger. What had started as a simple enlistment process was becoming something she didn't understand, something that seemed to reach back through decades of family history she'd never known existed. "Am I in trouble?" she asked, her voice small. Vance stood, her expression serious but not unkind. "No, Sarah. I think you're about to discover just how extraordinary your family legacy really is, and I suspect that ring is going to open doors you never knew existed." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The military transport plane's engines droned steadily as Sarah stared out the small porthole window, watching the desert landscape give way to rolling hills. She'd never been on a military aircraft before. The utilitarian interior was a stark contrast to commercial flights, with canvas seats and exposed rivets that spoke of function over comfort. Across from her sat Captain James Fletcher, a quiet man in his 30s who'd been assigned as her escort but had offered little conversation beyond basic pleasantries. Fort Braxton materialized below them like a small city carved into the North Carolina countryside. Sarah could see training grounds stretching to the horizon, obstacle courses that looked like geometric puzzles from this height, and clusters of buildings arranged with military precision. What struck her most was the isolation, miles of wilderness separating the base from the nearest civilian settlement. "First time at Braxton?" Fletcher asked, breaking his silence as the plane began its descent. Sarah nodded, her stomach knotting with nervousness. "I've never been to any military base. My father wasn't exactly supportive of family visits when I was growing up." Fletcher's expression softened slightly. "Your father served, didn't he? Sometimes the ones who've been there have the hardest time bringing their families into it." The landing was smoother than Sarah expected. As they taxied toward a cluster of hangars, she noticed this wasn't the main airfield. The planes here were smaller, more specialized, and the personnel moving around them wore uniforms she didn't recognize. Everything about this corner of the base felt different, more secretive. A black sedan waited on the tarmac, its windows tinted dark enough that Sarah couldn't see inside. The driver was a woman in her 40s with short auburn hair and the kind of bearing that suggested she could handle herself in any situation. She introduced herself simply as Agent Lisa Reeves, offering no branch of service or additional credentials. "General Morrison is eager to meet you," Reeves said, as they drove through gates that required multiple security checks. The buildings they passed were unmarked, their architecture deliberately nondescript. Sarah noticed there were no signs indicating unit designations or purposes, no helpful directories. This wasn't a place meant for outsiders, and she was beginning to understand that her presence here was highly unusual. They pulled up in front of a 2-story brick building that could have been an administrative office anywhere in America. Only the armed guards at the entrance suggested otherwise. Inside, the corridors were painted institutional beige and lined with portraits of military leaders Sarah didn't recognize. Their faces stern, their achievements listed in small plaques that gave away nothing meaningful. General Morrison's office was on the 2nd floor, behind a door marked only with his name and rank. Agent Reeves knocked once and entered without waiting for a response. "General, I've brought Miss Mitchell." The man who rose from behind the mahogany desk was not what Sarah had expected. At 68, General Marcus Morrison still carried himself with the precision of a parade ground, but his eyes held a warmth that contradicted his imposing presence. He was tall and lean, with silver hair cropped short and hands that showed the calluses of someone who'd spent time in the field rather than just behind a desk. What made Sarah's breath catch was his reaction to seeing her. The moment his gaze fell on the ring, his entire demeanor changed. His shoulders straightened even further, if that was possible, and for just an instant, she saw something that looked like recognition cross his features. "Miss Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying the weight of command. "Thank you for coming. Please, have a seat." As Sarah settled into the leather chair across from his desk, Morrison moved to a wall safe she hadn't noticed before. After entering a complex combination, he withdrew a slim folder marked with classifications she'd only seen in movies. He returned to his desk, placing the folder between them like a bridge across an invisible divide. "Before we begin," Morrison said, "I need to ask you something that may seem intrusive. That ring, when did you first put it on?" Sarah thought back. "This morning, actually. I'd kept it in a jewelry box since my grandmother died 16 years ago. Something made me want to wear it today, for luck, I guess." Morrison nodded as if this confirmed something he'd been expecting. "And you said your father discouraged you from military service." "Actively discouraged," Sarah corrected. "He used to say the Army ate people alive and spit them out. I always thought he was just being dramatic because his own service hadn't gone well." "Your father," Morrison said carefully, "was protecting you from something he couldn't fully understand. David Mitchell served one tour as a military police officer in Germany in 1983. Competent but unremarkable service. He had no idea what his mother-in-law had really done during her career." The folder remained unopened between them, but Sarah could feel its importance like a physical presence. "Major Vance said my grandmother's service was classified. How classified are we talking about?" Morrison's smile was grim. "The kind of classified where even I don't have access to all the details. What I can tell you is that your grandmother was part of a program that began during World War II and continued through Vietnam. It was called Operation Nightingale, and it involved placing specially trained officers in situations where conventional military solutions weren't possible." He opened the folder, revealing photographs that made Sarah's chest tighten. There was her grandmother, but not as she remembered her. In these images, Elizabeth Harrison was young, fierce, and dangerous-looking. She wore various uniforms and civilian clothes, often standing with groups of men whose faces had been deliberately obscured in the photos. "She wasn't just a colonel," Morrison continued. "She was one of 12 officers selected for deep cover operations that required skills most soldiers never develop. Language expertise, psychological manipulation, demolitions, assassination, extraction. Your grandmother could do it all." Sarah stared at a photograph showing Elizabeth in what looked like 1950s civilian dress, standing in what might have been a European street. Even in the grainy black and white image, there was something predatory about her posture, like a wolf in sheep's clothing.
"This is impossible," Sarah whispered. "She made me cookies. She taught me to knit." "The best cover is always the truth," Morrison replied. "She was your grandmother, and I have no doubt she loved you completely. But she was also one of the most effective operatives in American history. That ring you're wearing? It was given to members of Operation Nightingale as identification, not for the public, but for other members of the intelligence community who needed to know they were dealing with someone extraordinary." Morrison turned to another page in the folder, revealing a technical drawing of the ring. Every detail was documented: the specific angle of the eagle's head, the number and arrangement of arrows, the microscopic engravings around the band that Sarah had never noticed. "There were only 12 of these rings made," Morrison explained, "each one unique, but following the same basic design. They were crafted by a jeweler in Washington who worked exclusively for military intelligence. The silver comes from a specific mine in Colorado, And the engravings were done using techniques that would be nearly impossible to replicate today. Sarah held up her hand, studying the ring with new eyes. In the office's fluorescent lighting, she could now see the tiny markings Morrison was describing. Letters and numbers so small they seemed almost random, but clearly deliberate. What do the markings mean? Service dates, operation codes, and something we call an authentication sequence. It's how we know this ring is genuine and not a reproduction. Miss Mitchell, what you're wearing is not just a piece of jewelry, it's a key. The word hung in the air between them like a challenge. Sarah felt as though she was standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down into depths she couldn't measure. A key to what? Morrison closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. That's what we need to determine. Your grandmother left specific instructions in her will regarding that ring. Instructions that were sealed until certain conditions were met. He pressed a button on his desk, and Agent Reeves appeared in the doorway as if she'd been waiting just outside. Agent Reeves will escort you to quarters where you can rest and process this information. Tomorrow, we'll begin the real conversation about why you're here and what your grandmother expected from whoever inherited her ring. As Sarah stood to leave, Morrison's voice stopped her at the door. Miss Mitchell, your grandmother once told me that the most important battles are fought by people who never intended to become warriors. I think she was preparing you for something, even if she couldn't tell you what it was. Walking down the corridor behind Agent Reeves, Sarah felt the weight of the ring like a brand on her finger. Whatever she'd thought her life was going to be, art galleries, quiet creativity, a normal existence, was disappearing behind her like smoke. Ahead lay something her grandmother had set in motion decades ago, a legacy she'd never known existed. The guest quarters turned out to be more comfortable than she'd expected. A small apartment with military-grade furnishings but civilian touches that made it feel less institutional. As night fell over Fort Braxton, Sarah sat by the window, looking out at lights scattered across the base like stars. She thought about her father's warnings, his determination to keep her away from military life. Had he known something? Suspected something? Or had he simply recognized that military families carry secrets that can span generations, and he'd wanted to spare her from inheriting burdens she hadn't chosen? Tomorrow, she would learn what Elizabeth Harrison had really expected from the granddaughter who would someday wear her ring. Tonight, she could only wonder what kind of warrior she was supposed to become. Sarah woke to the sound of reveille echoing across Fort Braxton, the familiar military wake-up call filtering through her window at precisely 0500 hours. She'd barely slept, her mind churning through everything General Morrison had revealed. The ring felt different on her finger now, heavier, more purposeful, as if it were awakening after decades of dormancy. A soft knock interrupted her morning routine. Agent Reeves stood in the doorway, holding a military uniform in Sarah's size, complete with temporary name tags and insignia. "The General requests you wear this for today's activities," Reeves explained. "It's not official, you haven't completed basic training, but where we're going, civilian clothes would attract unwanted attention." Sarah examined the uniform, noting the quality of the fabric and precision of the stitching. This wasn't standard-issue gear pulled from a supply room. Someone had taken measurements and ordered this specifically for her overnight. "Where exactly are we going?" she asked. But Reeves had already disappeared down the hallway. The uniform fit perfectly, transforming her reflection in the mirror. She looked like a soldier, or at least like someone playing the part convincingly. The weight of the fabric, the crisp lines of the pressed creases, even the way the boots changed her posture. Everything combined to make her feel like she was wearing a costume for a role she didn't yet understand. Breakfast was served in a small dining facility she hadn't seen the day before. The other personnel present wore uniforms without standard military markings, their conversations conducted in voices too low to overhear. Sarah noticed how they looked at her, not with curiosity, but with something that resembled recognition. Word of her arrival had clearly spread through whatever community existed within this classified corner of Fort Braxton. General Morrison appeared as she finished her coffee, looking alert despite the early hour.
"Ready for a proper tour, Miss Mitchell?" They walked across the base in the crisp morning air, Morrison pointing out buildings and facilities that bore no resemblance to typical military installations. Instead of motor pools and weapons training areas, Sarah saw structures that looked more like corporate research facilities or university laboratories. This section of Braxton has been dedicated to special projects since 1947, Morrison explained, as they approached a nondescript concrete building. What you're about to see has been kept secret for nearly 80 years. The building's exterior was deliberately unremarkable, but the security measures were anything but ordinary. Multiple checkpoints required biometric scans, and Morrison had to input codes that changed every second on a device he carried. Even wearing the uniform and walking beside the general, Sarah felt like an intruder in a place where she didn't belong. The elevator descended much farther than the building's exterior suggested. When the doors opened, Sarah stepped into a world that defied her expectations entirely. The underground complex stretched out before them like a high-tech cathedral. Workstations equipped with technology she'd never seen occupied the main floor, while multiple levels connected by sleek staircases created a sense of depth and purpose. Personnel moved between stations with practiced efficiency, their focus so intense that Sarah and Morrison's presence barely registered. "Welcome to the Nightingale Archive," Morrison said, his voice carrying a note of pride. "This is where we maintain the records and resources of every operation your grandmother's program conducted." They walked through the facility, Morrison explaining the various sections. One area contained physical artifacts, weapons, communication devices, and disguises that looked like props from spy movies but were clearly functional equipment. Another section housed what appeared to be a library of documents, though the filing systems used codes Sarah couldn't decipher. It was in the third section that Sarah encountered something that stopped her cold. A wall display showed photographs of 12 individuals, each wearing a ring identical to the one on her finger. The faces were from different eras spanning 3 decades, but their eyes all shared the same quality: intelligent, determined, and slightly dangerous. "The complete Nightingale roster," Morrison said, following her gaze. 12 of the most effective operatives in American intelligence history. Your grandmother is in the center. Elizabeth Harrison's photograph showed her at perhaps 35, wearing civilian clothes, but with a bearing that marked her as military. Sarah could see family resemblance in the shape of her eyes and the set of her jaw, but this woman bore little resemblance to the gentle grandmother she remembered. "What happened to the others?" Sarah asked, studying the faces. 3 died in the operation. 4 completed their service and disappeared into civilian life with new identities. 2 continued working in intelligence under different programs. 1, Morrison paused, his expression growing troubled. 1 went missing in 1971 and has never been found. He led her to a desk equipped with the most advanced computer setup she'd ever seen. The screens showed what appeared to be a complex database, its interface unlike anything in the commercial world. "This is why you're here," Morrison said, settling into a chair beside her. 3 months ago, we received a signal from a source we'd thought was dead for over 50 years. Someone is using authentication codes that only a Nightingale operative would possess. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. "You think one of them is still alive? We think someone has gained access to Nightingale resources and is using them for purposes we don't understand. The signal originated from Eastern Europe, but our attempts to trace it have been blocked by countermeasures that mirror techniques your grandmother helped develop." Morrison pulled up a map on the screen, showing locations scattered across 3 continents. Red dots marked signal origins, while blue lines traced attempted communications that had been intercepted or redirected. "This isn't random activity," he continued. "Whoever is doing this knows our systems intimately and is specifically trying to activate old networks that have been dormant for decades. They're looking for something,
And we believe that something is connected to the rings. Sarah touched her grandmother's ring unconsciously. What could they want with these? Each ring contains more than just identification markings, Morrison explained, pulling up technical schematics on another screen. The metal itself has been treated with compounds that respond to specific electromagnetic frequencies. In simple terms, the rings can be used as keys to access information or resources that were hidden during the Cold War. The schematics showed the ring's internal structure in detail Sarah had never imagined. What she thought was simple engraved silver was actually a complex system of layered metals and embedded crystals, designed to interact with technology that hadn't existed when her grandmother was alive. "Your grandmother and her colleagues hid something," Morrison said, his voice growing serious. "Something important as they scattered clues among 12 rings and buried the full truth so deep that even we don't know what it is. But someone else has figured it out, and they're systematically trying to locate the remaining rings." He turned to face Sarah directly. "Miss Mitchell, you're not here by coincidence. Your grandmother left specific instructions that if anyone ever tried to reactivate Nightingale protocols, the ring holder should be brought here immediately. She anticipated this situation." Sarah felt the weight of generations pressing down on her. She knew this would happen. She knew it was possible. The Cold War ended, but the secrets buried during it didn't disappear. Your grandmother and her colleagues hid something so sensitive that it's still classified at the highest levels. Now someone is trying to find it, and they need the rings to succeed. Morrison stood and moved to a secure communication station. "We've identified the current locations of 8 of the remaining rings. 3 are held by families who have no idea what they possess. 2 are in private collections, sold as antique military jewelry. 2 more are in the hands of former intelligence operatives who've maintained radio silence since this began. And the 12th?" Morrison's expression darkened. "The 12th belonged to Colonel Marcus Webb, the operative who went missing in 1971. We believe whoever is sending these signals has his ring, and they're using it to try to activate the others." The computer system chimed with an incoming message, its tone urgent that several technicians looked up from their workstations. Morrison read the screen, his face growing pale. "What is it?" Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. "We've just detected another signal," Morrison replied, his voice tight with tension. "This one originated from inside the United States. Whoever is doing this isn't just operating remotely anymore. They're here." The room seemed to grow colder as the implications settled over them. Sarah looked down at her grandmother's ring, realizing that what she thought was a simple piece of family jewelry had just made her a target in a game she didn't understand, with stakes she couldn't imagine. "General," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "what exactly did my grandmother expect me to do?" Morrison's smile was grim, but not without admiration. "The same thing she would have done, Miss Mitchell. We're going to find out what they're looking for before they find it themselves. And you're going to help us do it." As if summoned by his words, Agent Reeves appeared at Sarah's shoulder, no longer the polite escort from yesterday. Now she moved with the focused intensity of someone preparing for combat. "General, we've got movement on 3 fronts. It looks like our discovery window just collapsed from months to hours." Morrison nodded grimly. "Then we accelerate the timeline. Miss Mitchell, I hope you're ready to become the warrior your grandmother always knew you could be." The briefing room filled with personnel Sarah hadn't seen before. Men and women who moved with the lethal grace of professional killers but wore civilian clothes that made them look like accountants or teachers. Their faces were forgettable by design, the kind of people who could disappear into any crowd. But their eyes held the same predatory alertness she'd noticed in her grandmother's photographs. General Morrison stood at the head of a conference table where multiple screens displayed real-time intelligence feeds. Maps, photographs, and data streams created a digital war room that hummed with activity as information flowed in from sources around the globe.
"Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison began, his voice cutting through the controlled chaos, "we have a situation that requires immediate response. 3 hours ago, we detected Nightingale authentication codes being transmitted from a location in downtown Washington, D.C. The signal originated from the Smithsonian Institution." A collective intake of breath rippled through the room. Sarah didn't understand the significance, but the reaction from the assembled operatives was unmistakable. This was worse than anyone had anticipated. Agent Reeves stepped forward, her earlier polite demeanor completely gone. "Sir, if they're operating from the Smithsonian, they have access to resources we didn't account for. The institution houses classified materials that predate most of our security protocols." Morrison nodded grimly. "Exactly. Dr. Catherine Chen, please brief us on what we're facing." An Asian woman in her 50s rose from the table, her movements precise despite the obvious tension in her shoulders. "I've been the Smithsonian's classified materials curator for 20 years, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who understood secrets within secrets. She activated a presentation that showed floor plans Sarah didn't recognize, underground levels and hidden chambers that existed beneath the public galleries tourists visited every day. During the Cold War, items confiscated from enemy operatives, experimental technology, and records from terminated programs were stored in specially constructed vaults. Access requires specific authentication protocols that were designed by intelligence specialists in the 1960s. Sarah felt a chill of recognition. Designed by people like my grandmother. Exactly, Dr. Chen confirmed. The Nightingale operatives helped create security systems that were considered unbreakable. But those same systems would recognize their authentication codes and grant access to materials that could destabilize global intelligence networks. Morrison pulled up surveillance footage on the main screen. The timestamp showed yesterday evening, and the location was clearly one of the Smithsonian's restricted areas. A figure in dark clothing moved through corridors with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where they were going. "We have partial facial recognition," Morrison explained, "but our subject is using countermeasures that suggest professional training. What we can confirm is that they accessed Vault 7 Alpha, which contains materials from Operation Nightingale itself." The room fell silent. Sarah looked around at faces that had gone pale with implications she couldn't grasp. "What's in Vault 7 Alpha?" she asked. Dr. Chen answered with visible reluctance. Records from 12 operations that were so sensitive they were removed from all other archives. Mission reports, technical specifications, and something called the Prometheus files. Documents that detail intelligence assets and resources that were never officially acknowledged. Agent Reeves leaned forward, her knuckles white where they gripped the table edge. "Generally, if someone has accessed the Prometheus files, they know the location of every dead drop, safe house, and emergency cache that Nightingale operatives established across 3 continents. We're talking about weapons, currency, false identities, and intelligence that could compromise ongoing operations 50 years later." Morrison's expression was grave. "It gets worse. An hour ago, we detected movement at 3 separate locations, 2 in Europe and 1 in South America. Someone is activating resources we'd forgotten existed." The screens around the room were updated with new intelligence feeds. Sarah watched in fascination and growing horror as dots appeared on world maps, each representing some kind of activity that the assembled experts found deeply troubling. "This is coordinated," Morrison continued. "Whoever is behind this isn't just looking for Cold War artifacts. They're building a network using infrastructure our own government doesn't fully control anymore." Sarah studied the faces around the table, seeing fear beneath their professional composure. These were people who dealt with international crises as routine business, but something about this situation had shaken them to their core. "General," she said, her voice cutting through the tension, "what exactly did my grandmother and her colleagues hide that's worth all this trouble?" Morrison exchanged glances with Dr. Chen before answering. "During the height of the Cold War, intelligence agencies on both sides developed assets that were too dangerous to acknowledge officially.
Sources in enemy governments, sleeper agents in strategic positions, technology that violated international treaties. The Prometheus files documented all of it. He activated another screen showing documents that had been heavily redacted, with only fragments of text visible. Your grandmother's final mission in 1967 involved extracting something from a Soviet facility that was so sensitive it couldn't be processed through normal intelligence channels. She and her team hid it somewhere, using protocols that only they understood. Hidden what, exactly? We don't know, Morrison admitted. The only clue we have is a single line from her final report. Package secured, Constellation Protocol initiated. Future access requires unanimous consent.
Sarah's mind raced. Unanimous consent from who? The surviving Nightingale operatives, Dr. Chen explained. 12 people created a security system that required all 12 rings to access whatever they hid. It was the ultimate safeguard, ensuring that no single person or government could use whatever they'd obtained without the agreement of the entire team. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. But if most of them are dead, then someone would need to gather the surviving rings and find a way to circumvent the security system, Morrison finished, which appears to be exactly what's happening. Agent Reeves spoke up from her position near the door. "General, we've just received confirmation that 2 of the ring holders from our watch list have gone missing in the last 24 hours. Margaret Foster in Portland and Robert Hayes in Miami, both grandchildren of Nightingale operatives." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Sarah instinctively touched her grandmother's ring, feeling its weight like a target painted on her back. "Are they dead?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Unknown," Reeves replied, "but their apartments were searched by professionals and both rings are missing. Someone is collecting them systematically." Morrison stood and moved to a tactical display that showed the continental United States. Red dots marked the locations of missing persons, while blue dots indicated the known positions of remaining rings. "Miss Mitchell," he said, turning to face her directly, "you're now carrying one of only 4 rings that remain outside enemy control. The question is, what are you prepared to do about it?" Sarah looked around the room, at faces that were watching her with something between hope and expectation. These were people who dedicated their lives to protecting national security, and they were looking to her, an art school graduate who'd stumbled into this world by accident, for answers she didn't have. "What are my options?" she asked. "Option 1, Morrison said, we take you to a secure location and wait for this to resolve itself. You'd be safe, but we'd be fighting blind while our enemies continue collecting rings and activating resources. Option 2, Morrison's smile was sharp and entirely without humor. We use you as bait to draw them out. Your ring is one they need, and your presence would force them to take risks that might give us an advantage. And option 3? There is no option 3, Morrison replied. This situation ends one of 2 ways. Either we stop them from accessing whatever your grandmother hid, or we find ourselves facing an enemy with resources we can't counter. Sarah stood and walked to the tactical display, studying the patterns of activity that painted a picture she was only beginning to understand. Her grandmother had been a warrior who'd faced impossible odds and emerged victorious. Elizabeth Harrison had trusted that someday someone would inherit her ring and understand what needed to be done. "If I choose option 2, Sarah said slowly, what exactly would that involve?" Dr. Chen answered before Morrison could speak. "We'd need to determine what your grandmother's team actually hid, where they hid it, and how to access it before our enemies do. That would require going to locations where Nightingale operatives conducted their final missions, following clues that were designed to be unbreakable, and staying ahead of people who've been planning this operation for months." "In other words," Agent Reeves added dryly, "we'd be asking you to become a spy in a game where the other players have been cheating for decades." Sarah turned back to face the assembled group, seeing in their faces the same quality she'd noticed in her grandmother's photographs, the look of people who understood that some battles couldn't be avoided, only won or lost.
"My grandmother left me this ring for a reason," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. She must have known that someday someone would try to access whatever she and her team hid. She trusted that whoever inherited her legacy would make the right choice. Morrison nodded slowly. "What's your decision, Miss Mitchell?" Sarah looked down at the ring one more time, seeing not just a piece of jewelry, but a key to secrets that had shaped the world for 50 years. Her comfortable life as an artist was already gone. There was no returning to galleries and quiet creativity while people died for something her family had protected. "Option 2, she said firmly, "but I have conditions." Morrison raised an eyebrow. "Such as?" "I want to know everything. No more classified briefings or need-to-know restrictions. If I'm going to risk my life for this, I deserve to understand what I'm really fighting for." "Agreed," Morrison said without hesitation. "And I want training, real training. If you're sending me into the field against professional operatives, I need to be more than just bait with a ring." "Also agreed. What else?" Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her grandmother's legacy settling on her shoulders like armor. "I want to find out what happened to Colonel Marcus Webb. If he's still alive after all these years, he might be the key to understanding who we're really fighting." Morrison's expression grew thoughtful. "That's a dangerous line of investigation, Miss Mitchell. Webb disappeared under circumstances that suggested he'd either been captured or turned. If he's involved in this current situation, then we need to know," Sarah finished. "My grandmother wouldn't have left this ring to someone who was meant to hide from the truth." The room was silent for a moment as Morrison considered her words. Finally, he nodded. "Very well. Agent Reeves, begin preparation for accelerated field training. Dr. Chen, I need everything we have on Webb's last known location and the circumstances of his disappearance. And someone get me a direct line to the CIA's Cold War archives. It's time to call in favors that are older than most of our personnel."
As the room erupted into focused activity, Sarah felt the transformation beginning. The uncertain young woman who'd walked into a recruitment office yesterday was disappearing, replaced by someone harder and more determined. She was becoming the warrior her grandmother had always known she could be. But as she watched the tactical displays update with new intelligence about enemy movements, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were already several steps behind, in a game where the rules changed every few hours. Whatever her grandmother had hidden was valuable enough to kill for, and the people seeking it had been planning this operation far longer than anyone had realized. The real question wasn't whether she could become the operative this situation demanded. It was whether she could do it fast enough to prevent a catastrophe that had been 50 years in the making. The training facility existed 3 levels below the Nightingale archive, accessible only through a freight elevator that required Morrison's personal authorization code. Sarah stepped into a space that looked like a cross between a gymnasium and a movie set. Multiple rooms designed to simulate everything from corporate offices to foreign alleyways, each equipped with surveillance equipment and props that could transform any scenario into reality. Agent Reeves had changed into tactical gear that revealed a network of scars across her arms and neck, evidence of a career spent in situations where survival depended on split-second decisions. She moved through the facility with the casual confidence of someone completely at home in an environment designed for violence. "Forget everything you think you know about spy work," Reeves said as they entered the first training room. "Hollywood gets it wrong in ways that can get you killed. Real espionage is 90% psychological manipulation and 10% adrenaline-fueled terror." The next 6 hours blurred together in a crash course that redefined Sarah's understanding of human capability. Reeves taught her how to read micro-expressions that betrayed deception, how to project confidence while suppressing fear, and how to turn everyday objects into weapons when circumstances demanded it. The training was intense, physical, and utterly exhausting. Your grandmother was exceptional because she understood that the best operatives are actors first and fighters second. She could become anyone the mission required: socialite, secretary, scientist, seductress. But underneath every role was a predator waiting for the right moment to strike.
Sarah practiced scenarios that seemed impossible until they became routine. How to plant surveillance devices during casual conversations. How to extract information from targets who didn't realize they were being interrogated. How to disappear into crowds and reappear where enemies least expected. The physical training was unlike anything from her civilian life. Reeves taught her how to fall without injury, how to break free from restraints, and how to incapacitate attackers twice her size using leverage and momentum rather than strength. Each technique was demonstrated with clinical precision and practiced until muscle memory took over. "Pain is temporary," Reeves said after Sarah successfully completed a particularly brutal escape scenario. "Death is permanent. Remember that when someone tries to convince you to surrender." While Sarah trained, Dr. Chen worked with Morrison to piece together the puzzle of Marcus Webb's disappearance. The archives revealed a story that grew more disturbing with each declassified document they uncovered. Colonel Webb had been the most enigmatic member of the Nightingale team, a linguistics expert who spoke 17 languages fluently and could assume regional accents so perfectly that native speakers couldn't detect his American origins. His final mission in 1971 had taken him to Prague during a period of heightened Soviet surveillance, where he was tasked with extracting a defector who claimed to have information about American intelligence assets operating behind the Iron Curtain. The mission had gone wrong in ways that suggested betrayal from within. Webb's extraction team found evidence that he'd reached the rendezvous point, but both he and the defector had vanished without a trace. Soviet archives captured after the Cold War's end contained no record of American prisoners matching Webb's description, leading intelligence analysts to conclude he'd either been killed immediately or had somehow escaped into deep cover. "There's something else," Dr. Chen said as Morrison reviewed Webb's service record for the third time. Webb's psychological profile noted an unusual characteristic. He was capable of completely suppressing his American identity for extended periods. Some of his colleagues worried that he was losing track of which persona was real. Morrison frowned at the implication. "You think he went native?" "I think Marcus Webb was uniquely capable of becoming someone else so completely that even he might forget who he used to be. If he survived Prague, he could have spent 50 years living as a different person entirely." The possibility added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. If Webb was alive and had maintained his cover for 50 decades, he would possess knowledge and resources that made him more dangerous than any enemy they'd previously considered. Their investigation was interrupted by an urgent communication from the CIA's European station. Agent Harrison Blake, a career intelligence officer based in Berlin, appeared on the secure video link looking haggard and concerned. "General Morrison," Blake said without preamble, "we have a situation developing across multiple European capitals. In the last 12 hours, we've detected unusual activity at locations that correspond to old Nightingale dead drops and safe houses." The map behind Blake showed a constellation of red markers across Germany, France, and the Czech Republic. Each marker represented a site where equipment or intelligence had been cached during the Cold War, resources that were supposed to remain dormant unless activated by proper authentication codes. Morrison's expression darkened. "How many sites have been compromised?" 17 confirmed, with reports of activity at 12 more. "General, whoever is doing this has intimate knowledge of Nightingale protocols. They're not just following clues, they're operating with the kind of institutional knowledge that comes from direct involvement."
The implications were staggering. Either the enemy had captured and turned one of the surviving Nightingale operatives, or they were dealing with someone who'd been planning this operation for decades with access to the most classified intelligence archives. Dr. Chen pulled up historical records that showed the locations Blake had identified. "These sites were established as part of the Constellation Protocol," she said, her voice tight with realization. "They're not random dead drops, they're components of a larger system designed to guide authorized personnel to something much more significant." "Guide them where?" Morrison asked. "We don't know yet, but the pattern suggests a sequence.
Each site contains information that leads to the next, creating a trail that can only be followed by someone with the proper authentication codes. Sarah emerged from her training session in time to hear this briefing, her body aching from hours of intensive instruction, but her mind sharp with newfound knowledge. The conversation stopped as she entered, all eyes turning to assess her transformation. Reeves had done her work well. Sarah moved differently now, more aware of her surroundings, more controlled in her gestures, with the kind of focused alertness that marked professional operatives. The uncertain young woman from yesterday was still there, but now she wore confidence like armor. "What's happening in Europe?" Sarah asked, reading the tension in the room immediately. Morrison briefed her on Blake's report while she studied the tactical displays. The pattern of activity across the continent painted a picture that confirmed their worst fears. They were dealing with an enemy who understood Nightingale protocols as well as the operatives who'd created them. "How long before they reach whatever they're looking for?" Sarah asked. "Based on the current rate of progression, perhaps 72 hours. But that assumes they don't encounter obstacles or resistance." Sarah nodded, her mind processing the information with a clarity that surprised her. The training had done more than teach her physical skills. It had awakened something analytical and strategic that she hadn't known she possessed. "Then we need to get there first," she said. "If we can't stop them from following the trail, we can at least control where it leads." Morrison studied her for a moment, seeing something in her bearing that hadn't been there that morning. "What are you proposing?" Sarah moved to the tactical display, her finger tracing the pattern of enemy activity across Europe. "My grandmother and her team created this system as a safeguard, right? They assumed that anyone following the trail would be authorized personnel with legitimate access to whatever they hid." "Correct," Dr. Chen confirmed. "But they also built in security measures to prevent unauthorized access, which means there are probably traps or diversions built into the system, ways to mislead enemies or eliminate threats." Reeves smiled with something that looked like approval. "You're thinking like an operative." "I'm thinking like my grandmother," Sarah corrected. "She wouldn't have created a system that could be compromised by brute force or stolen credentials. There has to be something that requires more than just authentication codes, something that requires actual knowledge of the team members or their methods." Morrison exchanged glances with Dr. Chen. "What kind of knowledge?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, her mind working through possibilities. "Personal knowledge, details that weren't recorded in official files, the kind of information that only comes from actually knowing the people involved." She turned to face the assembled group, her expression serious. "I think we need to find the other surviving ring holders, not just to protect them, but because they might have family stories or memories that could help us understand what we're really dealing with." "That's extremely dangerous," Morrison pointed out. "If we're right about the enemy collecting rings, approaching the remaining holders could put them at greater risk." "They're already at risk," Sarah replied, "but if we can reach them first, we might be able to learn something that gives us an advantage." Agent Blake's voice came through the communication system again. "General, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we've just received intelligence that suggests the situation is accelerating. Our sources report that several of the European sites contained more than just cached equipment. They held documents that appear to be pieces of a larger map or instruction set." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. The enemy wasn't just activating old resources. They were assembling information that would lead them directly to whatever the Nightingale team had hidden. Morrison made a decision with the speed that had defined his career. "Dr. Chen, I need everything we have on the remaining ring holders, current locations, security status, and any family connections that might be relevant. Agent Reeves, prepare for immediate deployment to the first location." "Where are we going?" Morrison's expression was grim. "Seattle. Amanda Richardson, granddaughter of Nightingale operative Colonel James Richardson, was reported missing 6 hours ago. Her apartment was searched and her ring is gone. But her sister called the police before the abduction, and the responding officers noted something unusual. There were signs of a struggle, but also evidence that Amanda had been expecting trouble." Sarah felt a chill of recognition. She knew they were coming. which suggests that someone warned her or that she'd received information that made her realize she was a target. Either way, Seattle might be where we finally get ahead of this enemy instead of constantly reacting to their moves. As the briefing broke up and personnel scattered to prepare for immediate deployment, Sarah found herself standing alone with her grandmother's ring, feeling its weight like a compass pointing toward danger. The comfortable life she'd known was completely gone now, replaced by a world where survival depended on skills she'd learned in a single day and knowledge she'd inherited from a woman she barely remembered. But as she looked around the facility where America's most dangerous secrets were protected by people who dedicated their lives to fighting invisible wars, Sarah realized that this was exactly where she belonged. Her grandmother had known that someday someone would need to carry on the fight that the Nightingale operatives had begun decades ago.
The enemy might have a head start, but they were about to discover that Elizabeth Harrison's granddaughter was every bit as dangerous as the woman who'd raised her to be a warrior. The military transport touched down at Joint Base Lewis McChord outside Seattle at 0347 hours, its engines cutting through the Pacific Northwest drizzle that turned the tarmac into a mirror of reflected runway lights. Sarah stepped off the aircraft wearing civilian clothes that had been carefully selected to make her invisible: dark jeans, a waterproof jacket, and hiking boots that suggested she belonged in a city where outdoor gear was everyday fashion. Agent Reeves emerged behind her, transformed from the tactical instructor of yesterday into someone who could have been a tech worker or graduate student. Her auburn hair was now styled differently, her posture deliberately less military, and she carried a laptop bag that concealed equipment Sarah was learning to recognize as standard spy toolkit. "Remember," Reeves said as they walked toward a waiting sedan, "we're software consultants from Portland investigating a cybersecurity breach. Our cover identities have been inserted into corporate databases and will hold up under casual scrutiny. But if law enforcement runs deeper background checks, we'll have maybe 4 hours before inconsistencies start showing up." The drive into Seattle took them through neighborhoods that gradually shifted from suburban sprawl to urban density. Sarah watched the city wake up around them: early commuters heading to coffee shops, delivery trucks navigating narrow streets, the kind of normal morning routine that seemed surreal after the intensity of the last 48 hours. Amanda Richardson had lived in a converted warehouse in the Capitol Hill district, one of dozens of similar buildings that housed Seattle's creative class in spaces that had once manufactured everything from furniture to airplane parts. The area hummed with the kind of artsy energy Sarah recognized from her own life before everything changed. Detective Maria Santos met them outside the building, her expression skeptical despite the federal credentials Reeves had provided. At 43, Santos had seen enough unusual cases to recognize when a simple missing person investigation was becoming something more complicated. "Your people were very insistent about getting access to the scene," Santos said, leading them through the building's industrial lobby. "But I have to tell you, this doesn't look like a federal case to me. Looks like a burglary that went wrong when the victim came home unexpectedly." Sarah studied the detective's body language, applying lessons from her crash course in reading people. Santos was competent and experienced, but she was also frustrated, the kind of frustration that came from sensing there was more to a case than the evidence suggested. "What makes you think Amanda Richardson was expecting trouble?" Reeves asked as they climbed concrete stairs to the 3rd floor. Santos paused at the landing, her hand resting on the door handle. 2 things. First, she'd installed a security system 3 weeks ago, expensive stuff, way beyond what most people in this building could afford. Second, her sister mentioned that Amanda had been asking strange questions about their grandfather's military service. The apartment door opened into a space that told the story of violence and preparation in equal measure. Amanda's loft was spacious and well-organized, with art supplies and computer equipment arranged in a way that suggested someone who valued both creativity and efficiency. But the signs of struggle were unmistakable: overturned furniture, scattered papers, and a spray of blood on the hardwood floor that crime scene technicians had marked with numbered placards. What caught Sarah's attention immediately was how selective the destruction seemed. The intruders had searched systematically, focusing on specific areas while leaving others untouched. This wasn't random violence, it was professional extraction with a clear objective. The security system recorded everything, Santos said, activating a tablet that showed multiple camera angles. Take a look at this. The footage began at 11:43 p.m. 3 nights ago. Amanda appeared on camera entering her apartment, but instead of the relaxed posture of someone arriving home, she moved with the cautious alertness of someone expecting danger. She checked corners, tested locks, and activated multiple security measures that weren't visible to casual observation. She knew they were coming, Sarah said, echoing Morrison's earlier assessment. Gets better, Santos replied, fast-forwarding the timeline. Watch what happens at 2:17 a.m. The screen showed 3 figures in dark clothing emerging from what appeared to be the building's freight elevator, access that should have required keys they couldn't have possessed. They moved with professional coordination, communicating through hand signals and approaching Amanda's door with equipment that suggested extensive planning. But Amanda was ready for them. The moment they breached her door, lights erupted throughout the apartment. Not standard illumination, but the kind of strobing, disorienting flashes used for tactical advantage. Smoke began pouring from concealed dispensers, and an alarm system activated that was clearly designed to summon more than just police response. She turned her apartment into a fortress, Reeves observed with professional admiration. The battle that followed lasted exactly 7 minutes and 43 seconds. Amanda fought with skills that suggested military or intelligence training, using improvised weapons and defensive positions that maximized her advantage. But she was outnumbered by opponents who were equally professional. The final moments of the recording showed Amanda being carried out unconscious, but not before she'd managed to trigger one last defensive measure. A section of the apartment's floor opened, revealing a hidden compartment where she'd apparently stored items too valuable to risk losing. The compartment was empty when we found it, Santos said, but there were impressions in the foam padding that suggested it had held documents and possibly a small object. Sarah and Reeves exchanged glances. Amanda had hidden her ring, along with whatever information she'd gathered about her grandfather's service. Detective Santos, Reeves said carefully, did Amanda's sister mention what specific questions she'd been asking about their grandfather? Santos consulted her notes. Jennifer Richardson said Amanda had been trying to locate military records that seemed to be classified at unusually high levels. She'd hired a private investigator, contacted multiple government agencies, and even reached out to military historians who specialized in World War II and Korea.
The pattern was becoming clear. Amanda Richardson hadn't been a random target. She'd been actively investigating her family's military history and had discovered something that made her realize she was in danger. "We need to talk to the sister," Sarah said. Jennifer Richardson worked as a nurse at Swedish Medical Center, and they found her during her lunch break in the hospital cafeteria. She was a decade older than Amanda, with the kind of exhausted competence that came from years of dealing with medical crises, but her eyes held the particular strain of someone whose personal world had suddenly become incomprehensible. Amanda was always the historian in the family, Jennifer explained, stirring coffee that had gone cold while she talked. Ever since we were kids, she was fascinated by Grandpa James's war stories. But 3 months ago, something changed. She became obsessed, spending every free moment researching military archives and genealogy websites. Sarah leaned forward, applying techniques Reeves had taught her for extracting information without seeming to interrogate. Did she find something specific that worried her? Jennifer nodded, her expression troubled. She said she'd discovered that most of Grandpa's service record was classified at levels that didn't make sense for an ordinary soldier. When she tried to get more information through official channels, people started asking her why she was interested and who else she'd told about her research. "Did she share any of her findings with you?" Reeves asked. "Some of it. She found evidence that Grandpa had been involved in operations that were never officially acknowledged. There were gaps in his service record that suggested he'd been deployed to places the Army claimed he'd never been. Amanda thought someone was deliberately hiding information about what he'd really done during the war." Jennifer reached into her purse and withdrew a manila folder. She asked me to keep this safe about 2 weeks ago. Said if anything ever happened to her, I should give it to someone who would understand what it meant. The folder contained photocopies of documents that made Sarah's breath catch. There were partial military records showing James Richardson's assignment to units that officially didn't exist. Travel documents placing him in locations where no American forces were supposed to operate, and correspondence between military officials that used code names and references Sarah was beginning to recognize as Nightingale protocols. But the most significant item was a handwritten letter dated 1967, addressed to "My future family" and signed by Colonel James Richardson. The letter was brief but explicit. "If you are reading this, it means the situation we feared has come to pass. The ring I'm leaving you is more than a family heirloom. It's a key to something that could change the balance of power in the world. We hoped it would remain hidden forever, but if circumstances force it into the open, remember that we chose to protect this secret rather than exploit it. The responsibility now falls to you. Trust no one in government completely, but find the others who carry similar burdens. Together, you might succeed where we chose to hide. The answer lies where the eagle's wings cast shadows on the stars." Sarah read the letter twice, her mind racing through implications that seemed to expand with each word. James Richardson had known that someday his descendants might be forced to deal with consequences of decisions made during the Cold War. "Amanda found this 2 months ago," Jennifer continued. "She spent weeks trying to decode what Grandpa meant about eagles and shadows and stars. She thought it might be a reference to military insignia or astronomical coordinates." Reeves studied the letter with the focused intensity of someone trained to extract meaning from fragmentary intelligence. Did Amanda ever mention finding other people who were asking similar questions about their families? Actually, yes. She'd been in contact with someone in Miami, a man whose grandfather had also served in classified operations. They were planning to meet and compare their research. Sarah felt a chill of recognition. "Robert Hayes?" Jennifer looked surprised. "Yes, that was his name. But Amanda said he stopped responding to her messages about a week ago. She was worried something might have happened to him." The timeline was becoming clear. Robert Hayes had been one of the ring holders who disappeared. Amanda Richardson had been in contact with him, sharing research that had made both of them targets. The enemy wasn't just collecting rings randomly. They were tracking family networks and eliminating anyone who might possess knowledge that could interfere with their plans. "Jennifer," Sarah said, "we need you to understand that your sister was involved in something much larger than family genealogy. The people who took her are extremely dangerous, and they're looking for others who might have information about classified military operations." Jennifer's face went pale. "Are you saying Amanda is dead?" Reeves replied honestly. "But we believe she's being held because she has information they need. The question is whether we can find her before they extract what they're looking for." Sarah studied the letter again, focusing on the cryptic references to eagles, wings, shadows, and stars. Her grandmother had been part of a team that created puzzles within puzzles, hiding critical information in plain sight, using references that would be meaningful to authorized personnel but incomprehensible to enemies. "Jennifer, did your grandfather ever talk about specific places he'd served? Monuments or buildings or installations that might fit this description?" Jennifer thought for a moment. "He used to mention Arlington Cemetery sometimes. Said it was the only place where eagles truly understood the weight of sacrifice. But I always thought he was just being philosophical." Arlington Cemetery, the national military burial ground, where eagle imagery is part of the landscape, and shadows from monuments fall across ground where America's military heroes rest beneath stars and stripes. If James Richardson had hidden something there, it would be protected by layers of security and reverence that made it nearly impossible to access covertly. But it would also be the kind of location where Nightingale operatives might have felt their secrets would be safe indefinitely. Sarah's phone buzzed with an encrypted message from General Morrison. "European sites compromised faster than projected. The enemy appears to have bypassed security measures we didn't know could be circumvented. Estimate 36 hours before they reach their primary objective.
Whatever Richardson discovered may be our only remaining advantage.
The timeline had collapsed again. Whatever clues Amanda Richardson had gathered might be the key to staying ahead of enemies who seemed to understand Nightingale protocols better than the people trying to protect them. "We need to get to Arlington," Sarah said, standing with the kind of decisive energy that surprised her. "If James Richardson hid something there, and if Amanda figured out where it was, we might be able to find it before the people who took her extracted the information they needed." Reeves nodded, her expression grim. "And if we're wrong?" Sarah looked down at her grandmother's ring, seeing in its worn silver surface the reflection of choices that had shaped the world for decades. "Then we'll find another way. My grandmother didn't protect this secret for 50 years just to see it fall into the wrong hands now." As they prepared to leave Seattle, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were racing toward a confrontation that had been inevitable since the moment she'd first put on Elizabeth Harrison's ring. The enemy had been planning this operation for years, but they'd made one critical miscalculation. They'd assumed that the descendants of Nightingale operatives would be as helpless as ordinary civilians. They were about to discover just how wrong that assumption was. Arlington National Cemetery at dawn was a cathedral of silence, broken only by the distant hum of Washington traffic and the soft footsteps of early morning visitors paying respects to the nation's fallen. Sarah walked through the gates wearing the dress uniform of an Army lieutenant, credentials and documentation that would pass any inspection thanks to Morrison's connections within the Pentagon bureaucracy. The cemetery stretched out before them in precise rows that spoke to military order even in death. White headstones caught the early light like an endless field of sentinels, while monuments to fallen heroes rose from manicured lawns with the kind of dignity that made conversation feel like sacrilege. Agent Reeves moved beside her in the uniform of a senior NCO, her bearing suggesting someone conducting official business rather than covert investigation. Behind them, at carefully calculated distances, a team of operatives Morris had assembled provided security while maintaining the appearance of routine cemetery activities. "James Richardson's grave is in Section 23, Reeves said quietly, consulting a tablet disguised as official cemetery documentation. "But given the cryptic nature of his letter, I doubt that's where he hid whatever we're looking for." Sarah studied the layout of the cemetery, her mind working through the puzzle her training had taught her to approach systematically. He mentioned eagles casting shadows on stars. In a military cemetery, that could refer to dozens of monuments. They walked past the eternal flame at President Kennedy's grave, where early tourists were already gathering despite the hour. Sarah noticed how the flame's light interacted with the surrounding monuments, creating patterns of shadow and illumination that changed as the sun rose higher. "The tomb of the unknown soldier," she said suddenly, stopping in her tracks. "It's guarded by soldiers whose insignia includes eagles, and it's positioned so that shadows from the surrounding monuments would fall across it at specific times of day." Reeves considered this. "But the tomb area is under constant surveillance and guard. Even with our credentials, we couldn't conduct a search there without attracting attention that would compromise the mission." Sarah's phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Morrison. "Intercepted communications suggest enemy team has arrived in Washington. Estimate 4 hours before they reach Arlington. Whatever you're going to find it fast." The pressure was mounting, but Sarah forced herself to think like her grandmother would have. Elizabeth Harrison wouldn't have hidden something in a location that required violating one of America's most sacred sites. She would have chosen somewhere that honored the military tradition while providing security through misdirection. "The Women in Military Service for America Memorial," Sarah said, her certainty growing as she spoke. "It's positioned near the cemetery entrance, features eagle imagery, and would have been under construction during the late 1960s when James Richardson was active. It's exactly the kind of location a Nightingale operative would have access to during its building phase." They made their way to the memorial, a graceful arc of granite and glass that honored the contributions of women in military service. The design incorporated elements that caught morning light and cast shadows in patterns that spoke to both artistic vision and mathematical precision.
Sarah walked the perimeter of the memorial, studying how shadows fell across the inscribed names and dedication plaques. There, where the eagle emblem cast its shadow across a section of granite that bore names from World War II through Vietnam, she noticed something that made her breath catch. Among the thousands of names inscribed on the memorial wall was Colonel Elizabeth Harrison. But directly beneath it, almost invisible unless viewed from exactly the right angle, were microscopic markings that matched the authentication codes on her ring. "Reeves," she said quietly, "I need you to create a distraction, something that will clear this area for approximately 10 minutes." Reeves nodded and moved toward a group of tourists, her bearing shifting into the authoritative presence of someone conducting official business. Within moments, she was explaining that a routine security sweep required temporary evacuation of the immediate area, the kind of bureaucratic inconvenience that people accepted without question in post-9/11 Washington. Alone with the memorial, Sarah approached the section where her grandmother's name was inscribed. The authentication codes were so small they were nearly invisible, but when she held her ring at precisely the right angle, its surface reflected light in a way that illuminated hidden engravings in the stone. Following the pattern her training had taught her to recognize, Sarah pressed her ring against specific points on the memorial wall. The ancient silver seemed to resonate with something embedded in the granite, and she heard a soft click that spoke to mechanisms hidden within the structure itself. A section of the memorial's base shifted slightly, revealing a compartment that had been sealed for over 50 years. Inside, wrapped in materials designed to protect against time and weather, was a metal cylinder that bore the same eagle insignia as her ring. Sarah extracted the cylinder quickly, conscious that Reeves's distraction wouldn't last much longer. The moment her fingers touched the metal, she felt a strange sensation, as if the ring on her finger was responding to proximity with something it had been designed to protect.
"Dr. Novak," he called out, using Webb's cover identity with casual familiarity. "Or should I say Colonel Webb? We've been looking for you for a very long time." Webb stepped forward, placing himself between Sarah and the approaching threat. "Victor Petrov. I wondered when the GRU would finally send someone competent." Sarah's blood ran cold. GRU, Russian military intelligence. The enemy they'd been fighting wasn't a random criminal organization, but a Russian intelligence operation that had been planning this for years. "The Prometheus files belong to us," Petrov said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who believed victory was inevitable. "They document operations that were legitimate intelligence gathering, not the conspiracy your team pretended to discover. Legitimate intelligence gathering that involved assassinating American officials and manipulating policy decisions that cost thousands of lives," Webb replied. "Your network was responsible for intelligence failures that led to military disasters spanning 3 decades." Petrov smiled with genuine amusement. "History is written by the winners, the Colonel, and today we're going to finish a war that began 50 years ago." The standoff stretched for a moment that felt like eternity. Then Sarah heard the sound she'd been hoping for, the distant whine of approaching helicopters that suggested Morrison's backup team was finally arriving. But Petrov heard it too, and his expression shifted from confidence to deadly urgency. "Kill them all," he ordered, and the cemetery erupted into violence. Webb moved with a speed that defied his apparent age, producing weapons and deploying countermeasures that turned the memorial area into a battlefield. Sarah found herself following his lead, her training taking over as bullets sparked off granite and shattered the morning silence. The firefight lasted exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds. When it ended, Petrov lay dead among the headstones he'd chosen to defile. His team either eliminated or fled. Webb stood over the body of the man who'd spent decades hunting him, his expression mixing satisfaction with profound sadness. "Your grandmother would have been proud," he told Sarah, as Morrison's helicopters settled onto the cemetery grounds with the kind of precision that spoke to years of planning for this exact scenario. Sarah looked down at the cylinder she still carried, understanding finally what her grandmother had expected from her.
not just to protect the secrets of the past, but to ensure they could be used to prevent the mistakes of the future. "What happens now?" she asked. Webb's smile was tired but genuine. "Now we do what your grandmother always intended. We expose the truth, we protect the innocent, and we make sure that the sacrifices of the past weren't made in vain." As Morrison's team secured the area and began the process of covering up a gunfight in America's most sacred military cemetery, Sarah realized that her transformation was complete. She wasn't Elizabeth Harrison's granddaughter anymore. She was a Nightingale operative in her own right, carrying forward a legacy that would continue long after the current crisis ended. The ring on her finger caught the morning light, its worn silver surface reflecting not just the past, but a future where some secrets were too important to remain hidden, and some fights were too crucial to be left to others. Elizabeth Harrison had been right. Warriors weren't born. They were forged by circumstances that demanded more courage than anyone thought they possessed. And sometimes, the most important battles were fought by people who never intended to be heroes, but found the strength to fight when the world needed them most. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.